Welcome back to the show, This Week in Social Studies. It's your host, Gary Brady.
You've got questions, we've got answers on This Week in Social Studies.
So, our little podcast is designed to bring you a weekly take on what is going on in social studies. Specifically, the show covers key United States history topics. The show follows a Q&A format where you'll get your questions answered in an objective manner. And that's why they say, you've got questions, we've got answers. Want to get your questions featured on the show? Then your journey begins here. You can send Mr. Brady a video message on Teams in the Teams side chat, or you can fill out the form linked in the discussion to submit podcast Q&A questions. Please note that to have your questions featured on the show, you must submit them no later than 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Thursdays. Welcome back to episode 2 of the pod. Remember back to episode 1 when I said there were so many questions that I wasn't going to be able to get to all of them? Well, that was true then. But here's the thing. Today, I'll be answering many of the questions that you all asked that didn't make it into episode 1. Now, here's the official agenda for this, our second ever episode of the pod. I'll start with those amazing and unanswered Q&A questions that were submitted. Then we'll wrap up things by diving deep into the week's questions that relate to how the war ended and what were the terms of peace. You don't want to miss this one. Let's get right to it. Sometimes it's easier to tell a story if you begin at the end. I know, this sounds counterintuitive, but when it comes to telling stories about wars, it's often the case that you can best understand what happened next if you begin in the end and then circle back from there. So here goes. After the war ended in November of 1918, and the U.S., along with the Allied powers, including Britain, France, Italy, and their allies won, the Central Powers, including Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, lost. There was then a peace conference that only the Allies attended. In 1919, a treaty was settled on that made only a few of the war participants actually happy. We'll talk more about this treaty today. Now, here's the big punchline for U.S. involvement in the war and the result of the treaty. President Wilson had presented an idea of a League of Nations. It was the crown jewel of his 14-point plan. The treaty that was adopted at the conference ultimately adopted the concept of a League of Nations. That is, an organization designed to mediate conflict and avoid future wars. But President Wilson and the U.S. did not join the League because the other Allied leaders at the conference refused much of what Wilson had proposed. Eventually, the U.S. would go on to sign separate treaties with Austria, Hungary, and Germany, but never join the League. While there was peace after the war had ended, it was not necessarily a peace that was going to last. If you need more background on how the U.S. got involved in the war, then I suggest you listen to episode 1 of This Week in Social Studies, which I've linked in the show notes. So, where does that leave us? Well, that brings us to some big questions that you, the listeners, have asked. Take it away, Producer Peyton.
Gabby asks, why couldn't the United States stay out of World War I? And were American people mad about the Selective Service Act?
Great questions, Gabby. I'll begin with the first part. Why couldn't the U.S. stay out of the war? There are a number of reasons the U.S. ended up ultimately getting involved. On the last pod, I spoke about how unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans put American passengers in harm's way. For instance, there was the sinking of the Lusitania. Events like this turn the public's opinion in the United States about getting involved in the war from being pro-isolationist to eventually being okay with sending troops to support the Allied war effort. But there was more to it than just safety. One of the impacts that submarine warfare had on the US was that it also impacted our ability to trade with Europe. Over the course of the war, more and more of our exports were going to Allied countries like Britain and France. They were our major trading parties. Not entering the war was going to have a major impact on the US economy because we had loaned so much money to the Allies and exported so much to them. If this all stopped, then the US would have been in trouble. Another reason the US came to the Allies' defense in the war had to do with the forms of government that each side supported. When President Wilson declared war on Germany, he boasted that our participation in the war was aimed at making the world safe for democracy. Britain and France had constitutional governments. France was a republic, and Britain itself became a democracy in 1918 when they adopted universal suffrage for all men. Germany, on the other hand, was a federal monarchy. The Kaiser ruled over the country during the war and his empire. This was at odds with the values that the US had been built on. Germany's allies were similar in that they were imperialistic empires like Germany. The Ottoman Empire was run by a sultan who had absolute religious and political power over large areas of the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and North Africa. For these reasons, the US was nearly forced to enter the war. Had the Allies lost, the US system of government would have been under attack by imperialist nations that would have potentially taken over all of Europe and beyond. Perhaps they would have even looked to America. Now for the second part of Gabby's question. Were Americans upset about the Selective Service Act? More than half of the American troops that served in World War I were drafted by way of the Selective Service Act. Actually, that number was closer to 70%. Why? Because not nearly enough men volunteered to serve. Still, the best description of the American attitude towards World War I drafts was that Americans were not quick to volunteer, but they were not unwilling to serve. So there were some instances of raids against men who failed to register for the draft in the US. One example was the Slacker raids in New York in 1918. But this government response to those that refused to register for the draft was largely criticized. People thought that it was too harsh. Overall, there was far less protest than in later wars, like Vietnam. Part of this might have been related to government censorship during the war. The government had passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918, which had made it illegal to speak out against the government during the war.
Nick G asks, was the U.S. conflicted over joining the war on side of the British?
This is a great question, Nick, because it connects to the fact that during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, the U.S. had actually fought against Britain. So why, just a century or so later, would they want to fight alongside Britain, now in 1917, in the most horrible war to date? As I stated in my response to Gabby's first question, the US was fighting for democratic principles. Britain and France may not have been perfect democracies, but they were a lot closer in principle to the American democracy than were the Central Powers. So to answer your question, Nick, time heals all wounds. By the time the First World War took place, the previous wars with Britain were a distant memory. I don't think they had much to do with the United States' decision to enter the war on Britain's side in 1917.
Kennan asks, Do you agree with the United States or President Wilson's decision to enter World War I? Or do you think they could have done something else to stay safe and avoid the war?
Kennan, this is a really tough question. I'll start with this. There are no good wars. And yes, staying safe and avoiding war are best practices for all countries to live by. That said, when it comes to World War I, it seems that Wilson and the US had little choice in the matter by 1917. Despite being an isolationist country, the US was still sucked into the war. Why? Because there was so much at stake. Leaders had to consider things like trade and the safety of their citizens abroad and the hope for a world where democracy was still possible. Not to mention, what about the senseless loss of life that was going on in Europe, a continent where so many Americans had recently emigrated from? The US entered the war for many, many reasons, not just one, and so it was very hard to judge the decision as being all good or all bad. In fact, it's unfair to judge it in such a polarizing way. In the short term, when the US entered the war, they were able to help end it fairly quickly, which put an end to so much conflict and brutality going on. Remember, there were relatives of many Americans fighting on both sides in this war. Many Americans came from Allied nations, but also many came from nations in the Central Powers too. When you look at this way, the US did a good thing for humanity by helping end the war sooner and saved countless lives. But at the same time, what about the American lives that were lost because of the war? This was not an American war. Did these young people deserve such a horrible fate that awaited them on the battlefield? Then when you look at the long term, the war did not end all wars like the US had hoped. It became just a precursor for a far worse war. Was the US involvement a reason for this? Should we have stayed out? At the same time, no one could have predicted what was to come less than 2 decades later when another war is fought. So I think it's unfair to fault Wilson for the decision he had made to enter the war. I think he did his best.
Alex asks, what would have happened if the US didn't enter the war?
This is an excellent question, Alex, and one that requires a good deal of inferencing. I'll do my best to give a few possible outcomes had the US not entered the war, because it is a contentious topic that is definitely subject to bias. The best thing about this question is that it really connects to where I was going with my response to Kennan. So let's dive right into it. Now, one argument begins with the fact that by the time the US entered the war in 1917, that the Allied powers and the Central Powers had been locked in a stalemate for 3 years already, and they had literally dug in as evidenced by the trenches. Some believe that had the US not got involved, then eventually the war would have ended with neither side winning. The result would have been a negotiated settlement where neither side got everything they wanted. Perhaps because of the negotiation and the compromises that came with this negotiation, a peace would have actually been more lasting than the one that actually happened. Maybe a second war would not have been fought, but the consequences for the participating nations, the Allied powers and the Central Powers, could have been immeasurably worse because no one can predict just how long the war would have dragged on. So the result might have been better in terms of avoiding another war, but the war might have dragged on indefinitely, making the loss of life even more staggering. So that's just one possibility. Here's a second possibility. Had the war been won by one side or the other without the US getting involved, then a much different outcome could have played out. Let's say that the Central Powers won. Britain, France, Italy, and their allies, and the colonies would have been overrun by empires of the Central Powers, and there would have been a new world order with maybe a totalitarian rule over a large part of the globe. Certainly, this would have been bad for democratic countries around the world that hadn't been involved in the war, like the US. In fact, the US would have been the one country from around the world that these empires would have eyed as the next potential conquest. The US has tremendous resources that they would have wanted. Being that the US had proven not to be a trading partner when the Central Powers needed it most during the war, this would have set the US up for a future of inevitable conflict. Now, here's the third scenario. What if the Allied nations eventually won and the US never got involved and never came to their aid? How would the US have been perceived by other democracies then? I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it to your imagination.
Seannah asks, did the Americans fight in both world wars?
Seannah, yes, the US fought in both world wars. In World War I, they waited a while on the sidelines while supporting the Allied war effort through trade and manufacturing. As World War II progressed in the late 1930s, the US again was on the sidelines. Much of this was related to the fact that the US was mired in a long depression by the time World War II had started. This was known as the Great Depression. The focus in America by that time was fixing its economy at home. But when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, killing thousands of US troops on their home base in Hawaii, it became impossible for the US to ignore the actions of the Japanese Empire and their ally, Nazi Germany. The interesting thing about all this is that in World War I, Wilson had committed to fighting the war to end all wars and to make the world safe for democracy. But then just 20 years later, a greater threat than Kaiser Wilhelm was threatening democracy around the world. This time it was a totalitarian dictator named Hitler, who was dead set on taking over much of the resources of the free world.
Emma states, I don't know if this counts as a question, but what's our next unit going to be?
Emma, I think this is a great question, actually. Our next topic is the 1920s. The most interesting thing about the 20s is that many of the troubles that we see today in the world are similar in so many ways to the troubles that the US faced exactly a century ago. You know, Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Time will tell if our experience in the 2020s rhymes with what happened in the 1920s, but my guess is that it very well could. The good news is that one of the names historians have given in the 1920s in the US is they called it the Roaring Twenties, meaning the 20s were a very good time in American history. A lot happened in those years socially, especially for women who got the right to vote in 1920. The 20s were not all good, though. The end of the decade saw many things that had been built up come crashing down on Americans. We'll learn about that crash, too. And now that we know where we are headed next, we have 4 terrific questions from this week's lesson on the end of World War I. I've linked the YouTube video in the show notes if you're interested in going back to the video for more facts. Just as a reminder, that was a video that Mr. Clemente and I had collaborated on. So that leaves us with our first big question.
Our first big question is, why do you think so few of Wilson's points made it into the Treaty of Versailles?
Let's start with who was involved in the Paris Peace Conference following World War I. The leaders from the Allied nations were known as the Big Four. The Big Four included President Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. Noticeably absent from the peace conference were any representatives from Russia or the Central Powers. From the start, the conference was one sided. This happened for a few reasons. One was that the war was fought in Europe, and France in particular was in ruins. Another related reason was the toll that the war had taken on the young people of these European countries who fought and won the war. In many parts of France and Britain, towns had nearly 90% of the men between the ages of 18 and 35 having participated or served in the war. The casualty rate was above 50% in many of these places. In fact, a generation of men had been lost to the war in parts of Europe, and there was a desire in France and Britain and Italy to make someone pay for this unimaginable hardship that families had experienced. So here's the thing. Wilson was outnumbered by European leaders who were much closer to Germany and the Central Powers. Sure, the US had saved the day and helped to win the war, but the impact that the war had on the US was clearly far less severe. In fact, many European countries believed that the US actually profited from the war. So as a result, Wilson's input was not taken quite as seriously as the other leaders of the Big Four.
The next question is, which one of Wilson's 14 points could have been added to help prevent World War II?
The parts of Wilson's plan that were rejected most by the three other members of the Big Four had to do with Wilson's desire not to punish Germany severely. Specifically, Wilson proposed that there be limited trade barriers towards Germany so that they could, too, rebuild their economy and their nation. He did not want the treaty to be a harsh punishment of Germany because he feared that a second war would happen if Germany was treated unfairly in the aftermath of World War I. So it seems that allowing Germany to trade freely as long as they accepted the peace would have been a good starting point to avoid a second war.
Our third question is, which one part of the Treaty of Versailles could be taken to avoid WW2?
Probably the biggest problem with the Treaty of Versailles was the amount of reparations that Germany had to pay. The Big Four insisted that Germany take complete blame for the war. Let me correct that. 3 out of the Big Four, not including Wilson, and insisted on a severe punishment. They determined that Germany should pay $33 billion in payments for war damages. These payments were known as the reparations. The problem with this punishment was that the German economy was not strong enough to make the payments, especially after such a war. As a result, over time, the Germans ended up just printing too much money, making the actual value of their currency fall. This created what was known as hyperinflation. This inflation hurt the German population because the prices of goods in Germany skyrocketed. For instance, let's say a loaf of bread would cost $1 one day. The next day, it might cost $100. And the value of people's salaries didn't go up fast enough to address that. So people began going hungry. Germany fell into a depression because of this, and it made the citizens in Germany resentful towards the Allied nations once again. By the end of the 1920s, a second war with the Allies became inevitable, and the penalties imposed on Germany were the cause of this. They were just too steep.
Gary Brady, the final question is, what terms make a peace treaty successful?
This is one of those timeless essential questions. No one can answer this question with complete certainty, but I think that by looking at history, we can give some pretty good ideas of what lasting peace treaties include. First, let's consider what didn't happen with the Treaty of Versailles. You see, the Central Powers had no input on the terms. Germany was largely blamed for everything, and knowing now what happened as a result of the treaty, that is, Hitler coming to power and another larger, more devastating world war happening, it's safe to say that good peace treaties involve input from both sides or all sides. Lasting treaties don't punish the loser as harshly as the Treaty of Versailles did. That's one part of what has been learned. Another term that would make a more lasting peace treaty is that the most important thing to consider is that avoiding future conflict between the two sides needs to be the most important consideration. Excessive penalties and punishments are not going to achieve this end. The excessive reparations that Germany was forced to pay as punishment led to incredible resentment and assured another conflict. Hopefully, we can learn from these errors. Well, that's all we have time for in this episode. I want to thank you and producer Peyton for her help with the show, and also all of those of you who submitted questions and took the time to listen and learn today. Till next time.
You've got questions, we've got answers. On This Week in Social Studies.